The sky over the alien world was dark like a deep ocean. Heavy clouds moved fast across the jagged peaks. The wind was sharp and full of cold, carrying the smell of rain and danger. Far in the distance, a sound like 1,000 drums rolled across the valleys. It was the voice of the Death Zone storm, a storm that no one in this part of the galaxy dared to enter. Every race knew the stories. Ships ripped apart, rescue teams lost, entire caravans swallowed by the storm's hunger. It was not only the wind and rain, but the strange invisible force that made the air itself twist and crush anything inside. To the people here, it was a cursed place, a graveyard for the brave and the foolish alike. At the edge of a cliff above the Death Zone, a crowd of different aliens had gathered, their eyes fixed on the black mouth of the canyon below. The storm clouds churned inside like boiling water. Lightning flashed in angry bursts. The sound of each strike echoed like a giant's roar. There was fear in the crowd, but also a small, desperate hope. For inside that terrible place, 3 small cubs of the Zarin species were trapped, their cries carried on the wind like faint broken music. The mother of the cubs stood apart from the rest, her long silver fur soaked with cold rain, her voice raw from calling their names, her large golden eyes full of tears. She had begged for help from the rescue teams. She had promised them treasures, land, whatever they wanted, but each team had stepped back, shaking their heads, their voices full of pity and fear, saying no one could enter and live. The Death Zone takes all. No one returns. The mother had collapsed to her knees, her claws digging into the wet earth, the storm's voice swallowing her cries. Then through the crowd came a tall human named Kane. His suit was dark and scarred from many battles, his eyes calm but bright. He moved like someone who had already decided what he was going to do. The aliens turned to watch him, some whispering that he was mad, some shaking their heads in disbelief. No one had asked him to help, yet he stopped in front of the Zarin mother and knelt down, the wind tearing at his short hair, his voice steady as he asked her where the cubs were trapped. She pointed with a trembling claw toward the heart of the canyon where the black cloud swallowed the rock. Kane nodded once, then stood again, tightening the straps on his gear. The storm raged louder as if it had heard him. The air around the cliff shuddered with every gust. Kane checked the seals on his helmet. A thin green light blinked on his wrist device, showing danger levels already beyond normal survival. But his face did not change. The aliens nearby shouted warnings, telling him the canyon had killed creatures far stronger than him, telling him even the strongest metals bent and snapped in there, telling him the ground inside was alive and shifting. Yet Kane simply lifted his rope and pack, his voice carrying through the wind as he spoke, saying he had no choice when young lives were calling for help, that fear was not stronger than the duty to protect. The Zarin mother reached for him, her claws brushing his arm, her voice breaking as she told him the cubs' names, her last words a plea to bring them back. Kane looked at her and gave the smallest of smiles, the kind that had no joy but carried a promise. Then he turned toward the canyon edge, where the drop plunged into shadow, his boots crunching against loose stones. The first drops of rain began to fall harder, turning the ground slick underfoot. Lightning tore the sky in half, bright enough to show the sheer walls of the Death Zone for a heartbeat. Then darkness returned, the air roared, and Kane began to descend the narrow path into the mouth of the storm, each step taking him further from safety. The crowd stayed silent now. No one dared to call after him. Only the sound of the storm and the faint cries of the cubs below guided him onward. Somewhere behind him an old alien whispered that no human had ever been foolish enough to enter. Another answered that perhaps foolishness was not the right word. Perhaps it was something else, something only humans seemed to carry. The kind of stubborn fire that ignored the odds, the kind that made them charge into danger not because they thought they would survive, but because someone else would not if they stayed behind. The words were lost in the wind as Kane disappeared into the gray, his figure swallowed by the curtain of rain, leaving only the echo of his last reply when someone had shouted that no one survives the Death Zone. His voice had been calm and clear above the storm, saying then, "Today, I will be no one." The first step into the canyon felt like crossing a line between two worlds. Behind came the light from the cliff faded under the thick gray sky. Ahead of him the Death Zone opened like the throat of a giant beast, swallowing the path in endless shadow. The walls rose high on each side, wet stones shining with the constant drizzle, every crack and ledge slick and treacherous. The air was heavy and tasted of metal. Each breath came with the faint hum of static as lightning charged the clouds. Above, wind slammed against him in sudden bursts, strong enough to make his boots scrape for grip against the slick ground. His visor glowed faint green as warning icons began to multiply. Temperature drop, oxygen fluctuation, pressure instability. Each alert flashing like a heartbeat. Yet his steps stayed even and measured as he moved deeper into the storm's throat. The sound was unlike anything outside the canyon. It was not only wind, it was layers of noise twisting together. The low growl of the gale mixed with the high screech of air forcing itself through cracks in the rock. Thunder rolled overhead like waves crashing on an unseen shore, sometimes so close that the vibration shook his chest. Far ahead between the bursts of noise, Kane could still hear it. The thin and desperate cries of the cubs. It was faint, almost swallowed by the storm, but he locked onto it as if it was a beacon. Each cry telling him they were still alive. Each cry reminding him why he was here. His path was narrow, no wider than his shoulders in some places. On his right the rock wall was slick and jagged. On his left the drop plunged into a swirling pit of mist and darkness. Down there the wind spun like a living thing. Small stones vanished instantly into the spinning fog, never to be seen again. Kane's rope was looped across his chest and hooked into iron bolts driven deep into the wall. He tested each one before trusting his weight. The metal groaned under the pressure of the gale. Yet it held. Rain grew heavier, striking his suit with the sting of frozen pellets. It clung to his visor, blurring his vision until he swiped it clean with a gloved hand. Above him lightning flashed white and blue, turning the canyon walls into jagged teeth for the blink of an eye. The roar that followed came so quickly it felt like the air was collapsing. His ears rang from the force, but he kept moving, body angled forward, hands finding holds where the rock allowed, boots finding rare patches of solid ground. A sudden gust hit him sideways, almost tearing the rope from his grip. He dropped to one knee, pressing himself against the wall, his heart pounding in his ears. The force of the wind was like a living hand trying to shove him into the abyss. His muscles burned as he held on, waiting for the blast to pass. When it eased, he forced himself upright again, teeth clenched, eyes locked ahead. He knew there would be more, each one stronger than the last the deeper he went. As the canyon twisted left, the ground changed. Scattered boulders blocked the path, each one slick and sharp. Kane had to climb over them, his gloves scraping against edges that tore small cuts into the fabric. Water poured between the gaps like rivers, threatening to pull his boots off balance. In one narrow gap he had to turn sideways and squeeze through, the walls so close they scraped his suit on both sides. The air here was even colder, and the cries of the cubs sounded closer, though now they were joined by another sound, low and deep, almost like a growl carried on the wind. Kane froze for a moment, listening. It was faint but steady, a sound that did not belong to the storm. His mind ran through the list of things known to live in the death zone. Most were not dangerous, but there was one that was. The storm predator, a creature that hunted by sensing movement through vibration, its body built to cut through the wind and strike before its prey could react. His grip on his pack tightened, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead. The growl faded, replaced again by the cries of the cubs. But the warning was planted in his mind. The canyon was not empty. The path widened suddenly into a small ledge, a rare flat space where Kane could rest for a moment. He crouched there, catching his breath, adjusting the straps on his pack, so the rope sat higher on his shoulder. His visor flickered as the system struggled with the static charge building in the air. He knew the storm was intensifying faster than predicted. The green light on his wrist device pulsed red now, the oxygen fluctuation warning louder, telling him the air mix was shifting dangerously. His suit filters would hold for now, but not forever. He had to move quickly. From the ledge he could see further ahead. The canyon walls seemed to fold inward, the space narrowing into a darker throat of rock. Lightning flashed inside, showing the path twisting like a broken spine. Somewhere in that darkness the cubs waited, and somewhere in that darkness something else might be waiting too. He rose from the ledge, gripping the rope once more, and stepped forward, his boots sinking into shallow streams of rushing water that tried to pull him toward the drop. Every sound felt sharper now. Each clap of thunder was a hammer strike in his skull. The wind screamed in bursts that almost seemed to form words. The growl he had heard earlier came again, closer this time, and followed by the faint scrape of claws on wet stone. Kane's heartbeat quickened, but his pace did not change. His eyes swept left and right, watching the walls, the shadows, the mist that moved too quickly to be only air. Then the growl was gone again, replaced by a flash of movement high. Above, a dark shape against the lightning, there and gone in the blink of an eye. The cries of the cubs grew clearer now. He could hear 3 distinct voices, each thin and frightened. They echoed strangely in the twisting canyon, making it hard to judge distance, sometimes sounding near, sometimes far. The storm's own voice seemed to shift them around like a cruel trick. Kane focused on the rhythm, on the moments between the cries, using them to guide his next steps. One hand always on the rope, one eye always on the shifting mist around him. Then the path dropped sharply into a slope of loose gravel and sharp rock. Water rushed down it in narrow streams. He half slid and half ran, his boots scraping for grip, his hands dragging along the wall for balance. Halfway down, a blast of wind caught him full in the chest, lifting him off balance. His rope snapped tight, swinging him hard against the rock. Pain flared across his shoulder, but he did not stop, forcing himself upright and pressing forward until he reached a small overhang at the bottom of the slope. Under the overhang, the sound of the storm dulled slightly, giving him a brief moment of stillness. The cries were louder here. The cubs had to be close, maybe around the next bend or two. But that also meant the predator could be close. Kane adjusted his grip on the shock baton at his side, the weapon humming faintly in the charged air. He knew if the predator struck here in the narrow path, his only chance would be to drive it back fast and keep moving. Waiting too long was death, for him and for the cubs. With a final breath, Kane stepped from the shelter of the overhang, the wind catching him immediately, rain slicing across his visor. The path ahead twisted sharply to the right, disappearing into a wall of swirling mist. Beyond it lay the heart of the death zone, the place no one had reached and returned. And somewhere in that heart the cubs still called for him, their thin voices cutting through the roar of the storm, drawing him forward into the unknown. The canyon narrowed again, the walls pressing closer as Kane moved deeper into the death zone. The storm above roared louder, its voice now a constant wall of sound that shook the very stone under his boots. Rainwater poured down the sides in countless streams, cutting the rock into jagged patterns, each drop cold enough to burn against his suit. The air here was heavy and full of grit, making each breath feel like pulling sand into his lungs. His visor flickered as static built in the atmosphere, each blink of the display showing new hazard readings, pressure rising, temperature falling, wind speeds climbing. His suit strained to keep balance and heat. But Kane ignored the red warnings, his mind fixed on the cries that were still faint yet steady ahead. The path was no longer a clear trail. Instead, it was a maze of fallen rock and unstable ledges. Huge slabs had broken from the canyon walls, forming barriers that forced Kane to climb, crawl, or squeeze through. Each move careful and slow. His gloves scraped against sharp edges, sometimes catching on jagged points that tore at the fabric. Water pooled in every hollow, some deep enough to hide gaps between the stones. The ground shifted under his weight, sending small rocks tumbling into the mist-filled abyss on his left, each one vanishing with no sound of impact, swallowed by the endless storm below. A gust of wind struck from behind, shoving him forward onto his hands and knees. His rope snapped tight, pulling against his chest. Kane pressed himself flat to the stone until the blast eased, his body tense as the wind screamed like a living creature around him. When it passed, he pushed himself up again, shoulders aching, his breath coming harder now. But his pace did not slow. Every second mattered. The cubs' cries came again, closer, carrying urgency and fear, and something else, a faint, low rumble between their voices that made the hair on his neck rise. Ahead, the path narrowed into a slot barely wide enough for him to pass. The walls were slick and cold, pressing on both sides. He had to turn sideways, inching forward with one shoulder scraping rock, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears. The slot curved slightly, making the light dim even further, and halfway through, a shift in the stone under his boot made him freeze. The floor here was not solid rock, but a layer of loose gravel over a drop. One wrong step, and the ground would vanish. His rope was the only thing keeping him alive. He leaned into the wall, sliding one foot carefully ahead, testing for solid ground. After several slow steps, he felt the path firm again and pushed onward. The slot opened suddenly into a wider space, where boulders the size of buildings were scattered like a giant had dropped them. Some were split open with deep cracks. Others leaned against each other, forming dark spaces underneath. The wind here twisted around the stones, creating whistling tones that almost sounded like voices. Kane moved between them, stepping over streams that raced toward the canyon edge, his eyes scanning the shadows for movement. The rumble he had heard earlier returned, low and deep, vibrating through the ground more than the air. It was closer now, too steady to be thunder, and it followed the rhythm of steps, not random bursts. Kane tightened his grip on the shock batten, its faint hum lost in the roar of the wind. He kept moving but slower, every sense alert. His visor caught a flicker of movement to his right, something dark sliding out of sight behind a boulder, too fast to see clearly. He stopped, listening. The cries of the cubs came again, louder, urgent. The rumble grew stronger, and then it faded, as if the thing had retreated. Kane exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady. He could not chase shadows. The cubs were his target. The next barrier was worse. A wall of stone had collapsed into the path, blocking it entirely from floor to ceiling. There was no way around on either side. The drop on the left was too steep and the wall on the right too smooth. Kane unclipped his rope from its anchor and began to climb, his boots searching for grip on narrow edges, his gloves finding holds and cracks. Water poured down over the stones, soaking his sleeves and making each grip slippery. Halfway up, a sudden tremor shook the wall. Pebbles rained down on him. The wind howled through the gap above, almost pulling him free. His muscles screamed, but he pushed upward, fingers digging into a final handhold, pulling himself over the top and rolling onto the narrow ledge beyond. From the ledge, he could see the canyon stretch ahead in a winding line, its floor scattered with more broken rock. The cries of the cubs were louder now, though they still echoed strangely, making it hard to judge exact distance. But they were definitely nearer. He could almost feel their fear in each sound. Kane began to descend the other side of the barrier, using his rope for safety, his boots sliding on wet stone until he reached the bottom, where the path turned sharply and dropped again. The drop led to a sloped passage that was little more than a chute carved by centuries of water and wind. The walls here leaned inward, funneling the storm's force directly through the gap. The wind hit him like a wall, driving rain and grit against his visor, so hard it rattled. His body bent forward into the blast, each step an effort against the invisible weight. His hands locked on the rope, boots searching for footholds on the slick slope. Halfway down, the roar of the storm was joined by another sound, a sharp clatter of stone behind him. Kane twisted his head, seeing only mist and shadow. But the shape moved again, a dark form slipping from one rock to another, silent except for the scrape of claws. The predator was real, and it was following him, moving with the storm, hiding in its chaos. Kane forced himself onward, knowing stopping here would only invite an attack. The slope ended in a narrow shelf overlooking another sharp drop. He anchored his rope and began to lower himself, his movements quick but careful. The rope hissed in the wind as he descended, water splashing against him from all sides. His boots touched the floor at last, and he unclipped, scanning the space ahead. Here the canyon floor was a chaos of broken pillars, some leaning like toppled towers, others split and jagged. Lightning flashed above, revealing the sharp edges in brief blinding light. In that flash, Kane saw something on one of the higher rocks. A long shape crouched low, eyes glinting for an instant before the darkness returned. The predator watched him, its body blending with the stone, its movements slow and deliberate. Kane gripped his baton tighter and pressed forward, the cries of the cubs now just beyond the next cluster of rocks, their voices thin but steady, pulling him into the heart of the maze. Every turn brought new hazards, loose stone underfoot, sudden drops hidden by water, narrow gaps that scraped his suit. Yet Kane moved through them with steady focus, never letting the storm or the shadows break his pace. The predator's presence stayed behind him, always just out of reach, but always there, like a shadow waiting for the right moment. Kane could feel its patience, its confidence. It thought the storm would do its work for it, but Kane had no plan to give it that chance. At last he reached a narrow crack between two leaning pillars. Beyond it the cries were loud and clear. He could hear the high-pitched whimpers of fear, the sound of small claws scratching against stone. He moved toward it, every step cautious, knowing the predator might strike before he reached them. The wind roared through the crack, the storm's voice rising as if warning him to turn back. But Kane stepped through, vanishing into the next chamber of the death zone, where the cubs waited and the predator's shadow followed close behind. The space beyond the crack was darker than the rest of the canyon. The walls rose high and leaned inward until they almost touched, shutting out what little light came from the sky. The air was thick with mist and grit, each breath heavy and sharp. The cries of the cubs bounced off the walls, filling the chamber with their sound. Kane could tell they were close now, no more than a short climb away. But between him and them lay shadows that moved when the wind paused, shadows that did not belong to the storm alone. The ground here was uneven, broken slabs tilted at strange angles. Water raced through the gaps with a hiss, carrying small stones into the darkness. The wind shifted in bursts, sometimes falling silent for a heartbeat, sometimes roaring so hard that Kane had to crouch low to keep his footing. In those brief moments of quiet another sound reached him, soft at first, then sharper, the scrape of claws against wet rock, slow and deliberate, a hunter's steps, each one measured and certain. Kane knew the predator was here now, not just following. It had chosen this place. The narrow chamber gave it cover and control. The noise of the storm masked its approach. The shadows hid its shape. Lightning flashed once through a gap high above, and in that instant Kane saw it crouched low on a boulder to his right, its body long and sinewy, covered in plates that shimmered in the rain, its head narrow, jaws lined with teeth that caught the light for a heartbeat before the darkness returned. Its eyes burned faintly, not with color, but with a cold reflection that locked onto him. The predator did not rush. It moved with the patience of something that knew the storm would weaken its prey. It shifted to another boulder, the movement smooth, claws finding holds in the wet rock, as if the storm's force meant nothing to it. Kane's hand slid to his shock baton, the hum of its charge faint under the noise of the wind. His other hand adjusted the grip on the rope tied across his chest. He had no time for fear. Every second here was a choice between moving to the cubs or holding his ground against the beast. The cubs cried again, the sound sharp with panic now. They could sense the danger too. Their voices drew the predator's gaze for a moment, its head tilting, nostrils flaring as it caught their scent on the wet air. Then its eyes turned back to Kane, reading his stance. The storm swelled again, pushing grit into his visor, blurring his vision. He wiped it clean with one glove, knowing the predator could use even that second against him. The first move came fast, a blur of shadow from the right. The predator leapt across the gap between boulders, claws sparking against stone as it landed. Kane stepped sideways, swinging the baton in a sharp arc. The charge connected with the edge of its armored shoulder, a crack of light flashing between them. The predator hissed, a sound like steam hitting cold air, and twisted away, retreating into the mist. Its movements so fast that by the time Kane steadied his stance it was gone again. Only the sound of claws above and behind gave away its path. Kane moved toward the cubs, keeping his back to the wall, forcing the predator to approach from the front. Each step slow and deliberate. The chamber narrowed here, water rushing ankle-deep around his boots. He could see now where the cubs were trapped, a small hollow under a fallen slab, the space too low for them to climb out. Their wet fur clung to their thin frames, eyes wide, ears flat. They pressed against each other, whimpering at the sight of him. But their fear was not only for him. They could see the predator moving in the shadows above. The beast struck again, this time from the left, its claws slashing at the rope across his chest, trying to cut him free from his anchor. Kane twisted, driving the baton upward into its jaw. The shock cracked against bone. The predator recoiled, but not far. Its tail lashed across his legs, almost sweeping him into the water. He caught himself on the wall, boots skidding on the slick rock, his grip on the baton tight, the hum still steady, the charge ready for another strike. The storm roared above, Lightning flashed again through the narrow slit of sky, and for a heartbeat the chamber was bright enough to see every detail. The predator crouched low, muscles coiled, water running off its plated hide, its eyes locked on him with a cold hunger. Kane shifted his stance, lowering his center of gravity, his mind running through his options. He could not hold it here forever. The cubs were too exposed. He had to get them out, which meant forcing the predator back long enough to grab them and retreat. The next move was his. He stepped forward into the shallow water, splashing hard to draw the predator's attention. The beast lunged, jaws opening wide. Kane sidestepped and drove the baton into its flank. The shock surged through its body, the plates along its spine shuddering as the current passed. The predator roared, a deep sound that shook the walls, and leapt back to a higher rock, its claws scraping deep grooves as it climbed. Kane used the moment to cross to the cubs, crouching low and reaching into the hollow, his hands careful as he lifted each small body into the rescue bag on his chest. Their claws dug into his suit, their trembling almost as strong as the wind itself. With the cubs secured, he rose, the predator above watching every movement, its tail curling like a whip. Kane backed toward the narrow crack that led out of the chamber, the water pushing against his boots, the storm's voice rising in his ears. The predator shifted to follow, but slower now, as if measuring the weight of this new challenge. Kane kept his eyes on it, knowing any break in his focus could be fatal. The cubs whimpered softly against his chest, their warmth a reminder of why he could not fail here. Halfway to the crack, the predator leapt again, landing between him and the exit, its body low, tail sweeping the ground. Kane tightened his grip on the baton, the hum louder in the charged air. He stepped sideways, testing its reaction. The predator mirrored him, eyes fixed on his chest where the cubs lay hidden. Kane feinted left, then lunged right, the baton striking hard into its side, the shock lighting the chamber for a heartbeat. The predator jerked, claws digging into the stone for balance. Kane pushed past it, the wind slamming into his back as he reached the crack. The crack behind Kane closed into shadow as the path ahead opened into a twisting corridor of wet stone and rushing water. The storm above howled with renewed strength, as if angry that he had taken the cubs from its chosen ground. The wind tore at his back with invisible claws. The cubs clung to the inside of the rescue bag against his chest, their small hearts beating fast under his gloved hand, their fur soaked, but their cries still alive. Each sound a reminder that the fight was not over, for behind him the predator had not given up. Its hiss carried on the wind like a promise, its claws clicking against the rock as it searched for another way to reach him. Kane's boots pounded on the slick stone, each step sending splashes of cold water up his legs. The rope across his chest swayed with his movement. The path tilted sharply downward, forcing him to half slide and half run. The narrow walls funneled the wind into violent bursts that shoved him forward and sideways without warning, each blast threatening to send him into the rushing streams that carved the floor into jagged trenches. He leapt over one such gap, his boots skidding as they landed, his free hand grabbing at the wall for balance. The cubs whimpered at the sudden jolt, but held on. A sound behind him grew louder, a scraping and pounding that matched his own pace. The predator had found another route, and now it was closing the distance. The thought pressed against the back of his mind, but he kept moving, eyes scanning ahead for any ground that could slow the beast. The canyon turned left into a section where the floor was broken into uneven slabs, some tilting under his weight, others shifting slightly with the water's push. He moved fast but careful, knowing one slip could be enough for the predator to strike. Lightning split the sky above, its light pouring through a narrow slit high in the wall. The flash revealed the predator bounding over the broken ground behind him, its body a blur of wet armor and muscle, eyes locked on the bag at his chest, teeth bared in silent hunger. Kane gritted his teeth and pushed harder, his muscles burning from the climb and fight before. But the thought of the cubs trapped here if he fell was enough to keep his legs moving. The corridor ended in a sudden drop, water pouring over the edge in a thin but fast cascade. Below lay a narrow ledge barely wide enough to stand on. Kane anchored his rope to a crack in the wall and clipped himself in, then lowered carefully with the cubs held tight, his boots searching for the ledge in the spray of water. The rope hissed under his gloves as he descended. He reached the ledge and unclipped, moving immediately along its length, the stone slick and sloping toward the void on his left, the roar of the storm below, rising like the voice of a giant. A shadow passed overhead, and he looked up to see the predator leaping down the drop without a rope, claws biting into the wall as it slid, the sparks from its grip lighting the wet rock in brief flashes. Kane moved faster, turning a corner into another section of path, this one twisting around a sharp bend with a low ceiling that forced him to crouch. Water dripped constantly from above, hitting his visor in cold streams. The cubs shifted restlessly against his chest, their tiny claws catching on the straps of the bag, as if they could sense the danger pressing in. The low ceiling opened into a wider platform of jagged rock, and here the predator struck again, bursting from the bend behind with a hiss that cut through the storm's roar. It lunged low, aiming for his legs. Kane twisted and drove the shock baton down toward its head. The charge cracked against its plated skull, the jolt forcing it to recoil with a snarl, but it recovered quickly, circling him on the slick stone, its tail swaying in slow rhythm. Kane kept his body angled to shield the cubs, his free hand gripping a piece of the wall for balance. Lightning flashed again above, and in that brief light the predator's eyes burned like cold fire. It lunged once more, jaw snapping at his shoulder. Kane shoved back with the baton, the hum of the charge rising as it made contact with its chest. The predator roared, the sound echoing off the walls like a drumbeat. It slashed with one claw, catching his arm and sending a shock of pain through him. The suit held, but the force staggered him. His boots slipped on the wet stone, and for a breath, he was falling toward the edge. He slammed his weight into the wall, regaining his balance, just as the predator charged again. Kane dropped low, sweeping his leg through the water to unbalance the beast. The predator stumbled for half a step, enough for Kane to drive the baton upward into its underside. The shock sent it leaping back, claws scrambling for grip. Kane used the moment to retreat toward a narrow gap at the far end of the platform, the cubs pressing tighter against him. The predator recovered quickly and followed, but the gap was too small for it to pass without slowing. Kane slipped through sideways, the jagged rock scraping his shoulders, and once inside he moved fast, the sound of the predator's claws scraping the entrance fading behind him. The gap opened into another ledge, this one high above a roaring river of storm water that rushed through the canyon floor far below. The wind here was stronger than anywhere before, tearing at his body with every step. Kane kept one hand on the wall, his boots sliding on the slick edge. The cub's cries almost lost in the noise. Behind him the predator's hiss returned, echoing from the gap. It was still following, finding a way through. Kane reached the end of the ledge, where the path dropped sharply. He slid down the slope, boots kicking up sprays of water, landing in a narrow hollow sheltered from the wind. In the hollow the noise lessened, but not for long. The predator landed above with a heavy thud, its claws gripping the edge as it looked down at him. Kane raised the baton, ready. The cubs squirmed against him. Sensing the fight was not done, the predator dropped into the hollow, water splashing around its landing, its body low, muscles coiled. Kane stepped forward, his stance solid, the hum of the baton loud in the confined space. The predator lunged, faster than before. Kane met it head-on, the shock lighting the hollow in a burst of white. The beast shuddered, its roar shaking the air, but Kane held the strike until the charge drained. The predator staggered back, eyes still locked on him. Then with a final hiss it turned and leapt back up the wall, vanishing into the shadows above. Kane stood still for a moment, chest heaving, the cub's cries soft against him, his arm aching from the fight. He knew it would not stay gone for long, but for now the path ahead was clear, and the storm still waited with new dangers between him and the edge of the death zone. The air inside the death zone was alive with a wild energy that felt like it wanted to tear everything apart, and Kane could feel the storm growing more violent with every passing breath, as if the very canyon itself was pushing him and the cubs away. With invisible hands the wind screamed in his ears, making it hard to hear anything else, and the rain felt sharper now, cutting against his skin like tiny blades. Yet he kept moving, because stopping meant the cubs would not survive, and he had already decided that failure was not an option no matter the cost. The path ahead was nothing like the one he had taken to reach them before. Now it was narrower and slick with a thin layer of mud that shifted under his boots, with every step threatening to send him sliding toward the jagged rocks far below the canyon, roared with the voice of 1,000 storms as the walls on both sides funneled the wind into a force so strong it nearly knocked him off balance several times, and he had to dig his fingers into the wet stone to keep from being swept away. The cubs clung to him inside the rescue bag, their tiny bodies trembling against his chest, and Kane could feel their fear like a pulse that matched his own heart. The injured one whimpered softly, and he adjusted his grip so the little one would be pressed more firmly against him, hoping the warmth of his body would help it hold on. The sound made him move faster, even though every muscle in his legs burned from the climb, and his lungs ached with the effort of breathing in the heavy air. Somewhere behind him a low growl rose up, almost lost in the wind, but Kane recognized it instantly. The predator was still following them, its patience unbroken. It moved like a shadow through the rain, its claws scraping against stone in a sound that was almost like metal on metal, and each time it echoed across the canyon, Kane felt a cold spike of urgency run down his spine. Lightning split the sky in a blinding flash, revealing for just an instant the dark shape leaping from one ledge to another far above him. It was stalking them from higher ground, waiting for the right moment to strike again, and Kane knew it was not just hunger driving it, but the thrill of the hunt. This was its home, and he was the intruder who dared to steal away its prey. Kane pushed forward, forcing his body into a steady rhythm, one step, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. The path twisted and dipped, forcing him to crouch low to avoid a jetting overhang, and the weight of the cubs shifted against him, nearly throwing off his balance. The mud was worse here, slick as oil, and he had to wedge his boots into tiny cracks in the rock to keep from sliding into the rushing water that tore through the canyon floor far below. The wind surged suddenly with a force so strong it ripped the rope from his hand, the safety line that had been his lifeline on the way, and now it danced wildly in the air before vanishing into the darkness. Kane swore under his breath and flattened himself against the rock, clutching the cubs close as he waited for the gust to ease. When it did, he moved again, but faster now, because without the rope there was nothing between him and the void. A sharp sound came from above, and Kane looked up in time to see the predator drop down onto the path ahead of him, its body low and its eyes glowing faintly in the storm light. It hissed, and the sound was almost lost in the chaos, but the meaning was clear. It would not let him pass. Kane tightened his grip on the shock baton and took a slow step forward, his muscles tense and ready. The cubs stirred inside the bag, sensing the danger, and their soft whines only made the predator lower itself further, preparing to spring. The moment stretched thin like the space between thunder and lightning. Then the beast lunged, and Kane swung the baton in a wide arc. The crack of energy cut through the air as the predator twisted mid-leap, trying to avoid the strike, but the baton caught its shoulder and sent a jolt of light racing through its body. It crashed against the wall of the canyon with a snarl, but recovered quickly, pacing to block the path again. Kane knew he could not fight for long in this place. The storm would take him, even if the predator did not. He feinted to the left, then broke hard to the right, using the narrow space between two rocks to slip past the beast. It snapped at him, teeth grazing the edge of his sleeve, but he shoved forward, using every bit of strength left in his body. The path bent sharply upward, now climbing toward the faint light that marked the edge of the death zone. Each step was a battle against the pull of the wind and the weight of the cubs, but Kane kept moving because the thought of stopping felt heavier than the storm itself. The predator followed still, but it kept its distance, now perhaps waiting for him to tire. Kane ignored it, focusing only on the next handhold, the next step, the next rise of the path. The rain was a constant curtain around him, and the air was filled with the endless roar of wind and water until it felt like the storm had swallowed him whole. The ground shifted suddenly under his boots as a section of the path broke away, falling into the depths below. He threw himself forward, just in time to land on solid rock again, his knees slamming hard, but holding the cubs safe. The sound of the falling stone was swallowed instantly by the storm, and he realized again how close death was with every single step. At last the narrow walls began to widen, and the wind lost just a little of its crushing weight. The light ahead was brighter now, and Kane pushed himself harder, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His vision narrowed to the opening that marked safety. The predator gave one final growl from somewhere behind, but did not follow any further. Perhaps the storm was enough to claim the canyon for itself. Kane stumbled through the final stretch, his legs shaking from the effort and the sudden change in pressure. The rain still fell, but it was gentler here, and the sound of the storm faded to a distant roar. He looked down at the cubs, their eyes blinking open in the softer light, and for the first time, since stepping into the death zone, he let himself believe they might all make it out alive. The wind at his back carried the scent of freedom, and beyond that the faint sound of voices calling his name. The world outside the death zone waited in silence as the storm roared like an endless monster behind the canyon walls, and every alien who stood on the ridge had their eyes locked on the faint shadow that fought its way through the swirling rain and screaming wind, and some whispered that the figure could not be real because no one had ever come back from there alive. And yet there he was, the human Cain, staggering forward, his shoulders hunched and his arms wrapped around the bundle strapped to his chest that held the 3 cubs he had gone in to save, and each step he took looked like it might be his last, but still he kept moving as if the earth itself pulled him toward safety. The storm fought him until the very edge, throwing claws of wind at his back and slamming waves of rain into his face, so hard that every breath was a struggle, and the ground under his boots shook from the rumble of faraway rockfalls. But Cain's grip on the cubs never loosened, and his gaze never left the faint glow of the alien search lamps ahead, and every alien watching felt a strange pressure in their chest, as if they themselves were trying to breathe through the crushing air of the death zone. And when he finally crossed the invisible border, where the storm's grip weakened the crowd, let out a single shuddering breath. Cain dropped to one knee, the world spinning around him, but he stayed upright long enough to unfasten the rescue bag and set it gently on the ground, and 3 small Zarin cubs blinked up at the sky, there for plastered flat by water, and their eyes wide with confusion and fear, yet alive and breathing. And that was all that mattered to the mother, who broke through the line of onlookers and threw herself to the ground beside them, her voice cracking with a sound that was half sob, half relief, and her trembling hands scooped them up, holding them so close that no storm in the galaxy could have taken them from her again. The aliens around them stood frozen, their minds struggling to fit this moment into what they knew of the world, because the death zone was not just a place, it was a law of nature, a place that could not be beaten, and yet a human had walked into its heart and come back with life in his arms, and they had no words for what they saw, no frame of reference to measure it against, and so they only watched the dripping figure of Cain as he slowly straightened and pulled his helmet free, letting the cold wind touch his bruised and battered face, and for a long moment no one spoke at all. Then one of the Zarin elders stepped forward, a tall figure with deep ridges along his skin and eyes that had seen more years than most could imagine, and he studied Cain with the slow, measured look of someone who understood the weight of this act in ways that others did not. And finally, he said in a voice that carried over the stillness, "You are no longer just Cain." And those words hung in the air as the elder continued, "From this day you are the Stormbreaker, for you went where no one could go and returned with life, not death." And the crowd seemed to breathe those words into themselves, as if claiming them as truth. Cain felt the title sink into him, though he said nothing, because words felt too small for the moment, and instead he looked at the cubs, now safe in their mother's embrace, and thought only of how close they had been to never seeing another sunrise, and a flicker of quiet satisfaction warmed the cold inside him, because the storm had not won, and perhaps that was enough. The Zarin mother looked up, her eyes meeting his, and in them was a depth of gratitude that needed no language, and she gave a small bow, a gesture among her kind reserved only for the highest honor, and Cain returned the bow awkwardly, not out of formality, but because it felt right. And around them the crowd began to move again, voices low, but filled with a new kind of energy, the kind that comes when something impossible has just been proven possible. The storm behind them began to fade, its power draining away into the distance, as if even it understood that the fight was over for now, and Cain knew that storms would come again and dangers would return, but this moment was theirs, a victory carved from a place where no victory had ever been before, and he hoped it would live longer than the scars on his body or the ache in his muscles. As the rescue crews moved in to check the cubs and guide the mother away, Cain stood there a little apart from the rest, feeling the strange mix of exhaustion and quiet pride, and perhaps something else, a small seed of wonder about how far a human could truly go when others said it was impossible, and maybe he had just taken the first step toward finding out. One by one the aliens began to approach him, not with words at first, but with simple gestures, a hand over the heart, a slight bow, a respectful nod, each one an unspoken acknowledgement that they had seen something they would carry for the rest of their lives, and Cain accepted each without needing to answer, because the truth was written in the way they looked at him, now not as an outsider, not even as an equal, but as something rare and dangerous and unshakable. By the time the last of the crowd had begun to disperse, and the lights of the camp flickered in the rain-washed night, Kane turned his gaze back toward the canyon and the wall of shadow where the storm had been, and he thought of the sound of the cubs crying and the weight of them in his arms, and how even in the heart of that chaos there had been something worth holding on to, something worth risking everything for, and the thought stayed with him as he walked toward the camp, with slow, careful steps, his body heavy, but his spirit strangely light. Somewhere in the darkness a low wind whispered across the cliffs, as if the death zone itself remembered the human who had walked through its rage and lived, and though Kane did not look back, he felt the truth of it in the air that carried the scent of rain and stone and quiet respect, and as he passed under the glow of the camp lights, the name followed him softly, spoken by voices of every shape and tone, the Stormbreaker, and he knew it would follow him for as long as he walked among the stars.